It's not uncommon these days to hear about different animals or plants that are in danger of extinction. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature keeps a list of threatened species, and they also keep a list called the Red List of species that are at the highest risk. And so you'll hear about these, especially in the news, when a new species is added to this red list. It's important to note that this list is basically for plants and animals with I would say, a bias towards animals. It does not include microbes, um, and really it's biased towards land and forest ecosystems, so not really as many aquatic ones, and again, it's more towards animals than plants. As they're categorizing species, they talk about them in terms of 3 levels of danger. There's species that are vulnerable, species that are endangered, and then species that are critically endangered. And the critically endangered are the ones that get the most press, of course, and that's understandable, but often by the point that they're critically endangered, it's hard to address the issue. So we should also be aware of the vulnerable and endangered species on this list. When they're trying to classify organisms to figure out where to put them on the list, there's 3 criteria that have to be examined. One is population size, so how many of an organism are left. What is the geographic range? So does this organism only live within a small area on Earth? Or is it spread over many ecosystems or areas of Earth? And then how are individuals distributed across that geographic space? According to this list, they've assessed, the IUCN has assessed almost 60,000 different species. Of these, 25,800 are low concern, and then 3,800 are critically endangered, 5,500 are endangered, and another almost 10,000 are vulnerable. So if you add that up, out of the 60,000, we have almost a third that are endangered or vulnerable. Of these, so if you broke down the 60,000, the families that are the most in danger are amphibians. They have the most critters on the endangered list, and then followed by mammals and birds. So part of this is we talked about there's a bias towards animals, and so part of the reason that most of the organisms that are critically endangered are animals is because we don't study plants as much to the same extent, and there's some animals we just don't study as much, like reptiles and fish, and so we may not know that they are as endangered as they are. So when we're assessing endangered species, there's a number of questions that you need to ask. So is this population shrinking? Is it steady, or is it actually increasing? How are other species impacting it? So is this species doing well and there's not really anything else that's taking over its habitat, or is there something that's coming in and taking over? And then is its geographic range getting larger or smaller? So is it spreading out, or is it contracting? When you're looking at geographic range, you also have to think about whether that geographic range is being fragmented, which can cause individuals to become isolated, and that makes it harder for them to mate in order to protect themselves in large groups. And when they mate, are they able to find other creatures that are that are different enough from them in terms of their DNA, and so they're not mating with their siblings. We also look at their habitat and whether it's being impacted by pollution or fires or development and clearing of land. And then finally, how closely are they related to other organisms that live in a nearby geographic area? One success story is the California condor. This pictured here, the condor was brought back from extinction in the wild. by a successful captive breeding program. And once there were enough of these birds alive in captivity, they were reintroduced to their wild habitat, and they have rebounded. So mass extinction events on Earth, extinction in general is not a new concept. Extinctions have been occurring over time. The average rate of extinction is about 0.1 to 1 species per million of species per year. And so there is kind of a background rate of extinction. But we have seen the rate of extinction rise very sharply over 5 different time points in the past in the history of life on Earth. Each one of these, we call them a mass extinction event, when that rate of extinction rises very quickly. So an example of the most recent mass extinction event was when the dinosaurs and 2/3 of all species on Earth actually went extinct, and this occurred about 65 million years ago. The most popular theory and a probable theory right now is that this occurred when an asteroid struck Earth, and this is called the KT extinction event, or the Cretaceous Tertiary event. I think I just spelled tertiary. It should be Tiary. So if you look on this chart, I like this because it shows kind of the history of life on Earth, and then it shows how there was an increase in biodiversity and then a mass extinction event. Increase in biodiversity, mass extinction event. This has occurred, as we said, 5 times in the past. The most recent one was when the dinosaurs went extinct, so there was a loss of biodiversity, and then the biodiversity has rebounded with the age of the mammals. Currently, you hear a lot in the news and in different media sources about the 6th mass extinction. And so we are seeing that the current rate of extinction on Earth is on the scale of hundreds to thousands of times greater than that historic average that we talked about. And that's being documented for many different types of species. So for marine and freshwater fish, amphibians, macrofungi, and some birds, their rate of extinction is much, much higher than that background level. A main reason for this is habitat loss. So about 50% of all natural habitats on Earth have been cleared for human use, which is leading to the extinction of organisms. Each year we lose about 1% more due to the clearing of land for human use. The past 5 events of mass extinction that we've seen in the past were natural events, but this 6th mass extinction is being attributed to human action. And of course, we really weren't around for those last 5 extinction events, so we couldn't be responsible for them because we weren't here yet. Another species that is thought to have gone extinct in the very recent past was the Baiji river dolphin, which was a local species in the Yangtze River in China, and that river has been dammed up significantly and polluted, and that species of dolphin is thought to be extinct. There are a number of different things that are leading to the 6th mass extinction event. The first one that we just talked about is habitat loss. This is thought to be the most important cause as we develop more and more land. That land's being converted to agriculture, forestry, urban development, so cities, and also dams. When we dam up a region, that land behind it goes underwater and is converted to a new use. Another way in which we have habitat loss is just pollution. As we add pollution to waterways, those ecosystems are no longer as functional. And when we till up soil or pump groundwater out, then we deplete groundwater supplies and cause loss of riparian areas or river areas. Another way that we lead to mass extinction is through habitat fragmentation. So this is just like habitat loss, except you're not really losing the whole ecosystem, you're just fragmenting ecosystems. So for an example, when you put a road through an ecosystem, you're fragmenting that ecosystem into two sides of the road, and these organisms can't always cross, or when they do, that they experience a loss of critters that get hit by cars, for example. When you fragment the ecosystem, the edges of that ecosystem are more vulnerable to light, wind, air, and water pollution than the interior of the ecosystem. And then it's also harder for organisms to mate and to defend their groups from predators. It also makes it harder for them to forage and find access to water, and it crowds them into smaller spaces. Invasive species are another factor that's leading to extinction and loss of biodiversity. So a lot of this is from humans, so we travel around and we transport organisms from their indigenous area to new areas, and when they encounter these new areas, sometimes they die off and sometimes they take over. They take over when they can adapt to that area, but they don't have a natural predator that can control that species. Exotic species invasion threatens about half of all endangered species in the United States. So I have two different invasive species pictured on this slide. One is the tamarisk, which is also more commonly known as the salt cedar. This is an invasive species in the southwestern United States along riverways such as the Colorado River. This salt cedar, it grows very quickly, and it uses up water that could have been used by other indigenous species. Another invasive species is the zebra mussel. These mussels have taken over the Great Lakes, and they're outcompeting other indigenous species that live in these waterways. And they travel from one boat, on boats, like on a propeller of a boat, and they travel from one waterway to another, and they can be introduced very quickly to new waterways. Other factors are like over-harvesting of natural population. So when we go fishing and we fish too many of any particular species, that depletes their populations. If we hunt too many of a particular species, that depletes their population. And then pollution. Pollution can also impact species because it alters the biological functions, or it can alter their environmental conditions that allows animals and plants to thrive. So an example of pollutions would be pesticides, herbicides, and excess nutrient that, so when we fertilize crops, for example, excess nitrogen and phosphorus goes into waterways, and that phosphorus can lead to algal blooms that use up all oxygen in a waterway, and then other organisms that depend on that oxygen, like fish, die off. Turbidity in water, so too much dust or runoff of dirt into the waterway clouds it, and it's harder for species to live. Thermal pollution is when waterways change temperature, and that changes the amount of oxygen that's dissolved in the waterway. And then this eagle pictured here. So eagle populations began to decline in the 1940s and 50s because of the pesticide DDT. DDT was causing eggshells of eagles to become too thin and they would break. And when we banned DDT, that allowed these eagle populations to rebound. And then the elephant in the room when we talk about biodiversity and extinctions is global climate change. So there's many ways that global climate change is impacting populations. The main ones that you think about would be warmer global temperature and changes in rainfall patterns. This will shift the climate zones, and so animals have to migrate in order to stay within the climate zones that they prefer. And plants, to a lesser extent, can kind of not migrate, but they can shift where they're growing, and kind of they can spread their seeds to a slightly different area where they can grow. It's not always possible, so some organisms just can't move, and so they are subject to extinction. In addition, some animals or plants will have to change the timing of their breeding cycle as a result of these shifting climate zones. An example of an animal that just doesn't have anywhere else to go to would be polar bears. Polar bears hunt for food on the Arctic sea ice. So these organisms, polar bears, really spend most of their time out on the sea hunting. They don't really live on land very much. And as the sea ice that they depend on for where they rest and where they lay down to wait for a seal to come up for air, as the sea ice disappears, these bears are starving and they're also drowning because there's longer distances to swim between chunks of ice. And so polar bears are at high risk because of their disappearing ecosystem. So it seems silly that we should have to talk about why is biodiversity important. It's important because it's important for all the animals that are dying off and all the plants that are dying off. But in terms of its importance to humans, there's many reasons that biodiversity is important to us. But we don't want to lose the ability to find new sources of food, medicine, fuels, and jobs. And so as we lose biodiversity, there may be medicines that exist in certain plants that we will never know about because they die off before they've been discovered. Plants also are critically important for keeping topsoil in place which prevents dust storms and also allows for the growth of more plants, which is good in general. Plants and topsoil help us to have clean drinking water, and also wetlands are very important for filtering and cleaning water. And then finally, there's just the aesthetic value of biodiversity. So natural spaces are beautiful, they're peaceful, and they are very important to our mental health when we can interact with these natural spaces. If you'd like to look up, there's a number of resources that were used in these talks about biodiversity. Please check them out.